The recording is in progress. So let's overview what we've done so far, what we finished with last week. And I, in my head, draw a kind of line in the sand. Introductory material was completed and concluded last week. We've essentially established one, well, let's say two major facts, which are intuitive, but needed to be really unpacked. Two major facts over the first, I think it's two, maybe we did 3 weeks so far. How many weeks have we had a semester? 3 already? Lord above. Okay. So we've established two facts in 3 weeks, which isn't bad. One more fact and we'd have a fact a week. So two facts. Dante is not writing in a vacuum. And the second fact is the Inferno is not written in a vacuum. And those, of course, go together. We've established over the last 3 weeks, Dante doesn't live in a vacuum. We've looked at his biography. We've looked at the economic, political, social, religious upheaval that defined his time. We've seen how the fabric of European Florentine culture was in a state of upheaval with massive changes and shifts that really saw public vice on the rise. So we've kind of defined Dante's life, his private tribulations, his family situation, the losses he experienced in his youth, the responsibility as a product of those losses that he was thrust into in his youth, his political career, his expulsion, his reaction to expulsion as that evolved over time, initially trying to return to his home city and then giving up on it and embracing the itinerancy that defined his exilic life. So we've seen Dante as a figure. We know the major events of his life. We noted the exile from Florence and his encounter with Beatrice, who will become a prominent figure in the comedy in the Inferno and later in the Paradise far more. But those are the two major events. We've noted the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, which are just funny words that the English poet suggested may as well be elf and goblins. But we understand that there are factions, that Dante was one of the Guelphs, which then subdivided into the black and white Guelphs. He was associated with the black Guelphs, who were ousted essentially. Sorry, he was associated with the white Guelphs who were associated against the current Pope. The Pope did committed treason behind his back and led him to be sentenced to death upon return to Florence. That's his private life. He's not living in a vacuum. I know we had the Super Bowl 2 nights ago. Was Dante in it? Were the Eagles in it? I don't know who was in it. Tom Brady won. That's all I know, right? But he was playing for a new team. And it was his 7th one, and he's 43. These are all pertinent pieces of information that I could quite do with emptying out of my head. But the Eagles were not in it. Okay, either way. Dante did not live in a vacuum. It's not just a name. We now have a bit of a sense of where he lived, when he lived. In terms of the Jewish context, he was born in 1265. This is around the age of Maimonides, where, as we've noted, rationalism, Neo-Aristotelianism, Greek thought was re-entering into religious circles, which leads us to the next point, that not only was Dante not in a vacuum, the Inferno wasn't in a vacuum, even though it has been compellingly constructed in a way that grabs the imagination almost in a vacuum as a tale unto itself, a man being taken on a journey through hell who meets figures being tormented in horrific ways. That is a compelling tale on its own, but we've noted over the last week and a half that it was not in a vacuum. There were Western, Greek, Roman influences, and there were Jewish, Hebrew, Christian influences, which we divided somewhat into secular and spiritual influences, which also subdivide into formal and substantive influences, the form being narrative poetry and the content substance being the philosophy. We're not going to remunerate all those figures. There were essentially 4 Roman poets who were most influential, the most influential being Virgil, who appears centrally in the Inferno as his guide. We noted beyond the poets of Rome, Aristotle, the Greek thinker, who is going to be our focus today for the record when you're preparing. Today is Aristotle's center stage. So he is the main substantial influence over the Inferno. And then we had the Hebrew, Jerusalem, Jewish, spiritual influences, the biblical text being front and center. and then a number of other thinkers, Boethius, St. Francis, Augustine, which will feature along the way. That was what we've done so far in the last 3 weeks. Why it took 10 minutes now and 3 weeks then, no one will know. But that is where we're up to. Just as a point of interest, I assume on your screens, the Zoom is taking up a lot of space. How do you take notes at the same time? If you're taking notes, you may not be
Split
taking.
screen.
You do a split screen?
You can minimize it also.
That must make it, like if I'm showing you a screen though, that must make it very hard to see, right? It's very small.
No, it fits in. If you do a regular full split screen, it's there.
Oh, okay. All right, great.
I'm in the library, so I can get a lot of computers.
Say again.
I can get a lot of computers. Yeah.
Right, you could light it up, get everybody seeing our screen. That would be good. Oh, Simcha, good to see you. I'll mark you in. You okay?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so that's where we're up to so far. Today, as we say, line in the sand, we've put all the lack of vacuuming, which also defines my home life at the moment, to the side. And we're going to think about stepping forward this week as also a separate pocket in terms of the syllabus. We're focusing on the shape of hell. Nowadays, obviously, with GPS, we tend not to know where on earth we're going. We just enter an address and we head there. But 2 decades ago, when old people used to get around, not people our age, and I like how I bracket you in your age, they would have to get out on a map in advance and trace out where they would go, plan where we're going to take our stop to refuel, how are we going to, just to get a lay of the land. We are trying to operate in the old-fashioned sense, that we're not going to just know that there's a destination and begin the inferno, but get a sense for the lay of the land. What is the structure? Because along the way, there are going to be all sorts of lessons that are intended for us to get a sense of what Virgil or Dante means that we can only appreciate when we know the structure of the whole. So I'm going to give you an overlay of the whole structure of the Inferno today. So if there's 2 points I want you to get away from today, one is a rough sense of what hell looks like in terms of its structure, not necessarily its texture, but its structure. And secondly is Aristotle's view of the human condition. Those are the 2 things we're going to get from here. Yes, Benson?
Do we believe that hell is physical or that's like a spiritual thing?
Does he or do we use it?
We.
It's complicated. There are certainly rabbinic texts that indicate it has texture, it is physical, that there is pain inflicted on the soul that is somehow incarnated to have pain receptors. As we noted last time, Maimonides believes that that's pagan influences, and it's beyond comprehension. We can't even begin to describe it. And it's unclear what Dante thinks as well. But he certainly writes this narrative as if it is physical. But what is helpful, which is important, I'm glad you mentioned this because I forgot to note it. When we said Inferno is not in a vacuum, we noted the influences, but we also, and I forgot to mention this, we spent 1 session on Dante's introduction. It's not written in a vacuum. The author himself tells you, this is what I'm intending to do. And it is not just a story, and it is not my version of what I believe hell really is per se. But he's saying what I'm doing now is trying to communicate a message for how we should live now on earth, the moral message for how we should be. Anyone remember what he said his ultimate aim, what the goal of the work is?
Provide the morals.
Excellent. To provide the morals and to lead people from despair to
Happiness.
happiness. That's his aim. I want to make people happy. And as we noted at the time, it is so important not to see the word happy as entertaining. There are all sorts of television shows that say my aim is happiness. Isn't that like the McDonald's thing? Did I make that up to make people happy? Happy Meal. There you go. It's, what is it? Isn't that Coke?
McDonald's.
Oh, all right. Well, either way. So the idea, you got Happy Meals, right? Meaning the point there is to make you feel good on some sort of material level. That is not what he wants to do. He wants to make people feel spiritually happy. What is the Hebrew word, as we noted, for happiness in this context? Say again?
Doesn't my name mean happiness as well, Asher?
Yes, Asha, right. So Simcha, I think we would say, I don't know what Israeli McDonald's have, but if they have a Happy Meal, I imagine it's a Sudat Samech or something, right? But it's not a Sudat Osher. It's not, Ashrei is a fundamentally different kind of happiness. And next time, not today, but next time, we're going to wrap the Malbim and Tehillim and Ashrei into the structure that Dante chooses for hell, even though, of course, he wasn't familiar with the Malbim because he didn't read Hebrew. And
Wasn't alive yet.
yeah, he wasn't born yet. That's also another important point. But so this is fundamentally a spiritual kind of happiness. That's what he wants. So when we say the inferno is not in a vacuum, we think about all the influences that lead and weave into it, but also Dante's point that and he makes 2 points essentially, if we want to draw away. And again, these reviews, are helpful. They're helpful to me when I think about how can we review this material, and I hope they're helpful to you as reviewing this material. There are 2 main things we can take away from his letter to Can Grande, the introduction. There were lots of things that he said, including why it's called the comedy, some fascinating background on the meaning of tragedy and comedy historically, but 2 major things for our purposes, which is the text is written to be polysemic, meaning with multiple meanings. He's saying this is not just a plain narrative, a story that is meant to be taken literally or as a work of fiction. It is not meant to just be read on the surface. It has multiple layers of meaning. That's the first point. And the second point is he's saying, I've got a stated aim here, which is spiritual redemption. I want people to finish reading the comedy, the Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise, and come away thinking, I now know how I should live my life in a spiritually redemptive way. That's what he wants. So those are important contexts. So Benzi, yes, thank you. It's unclear if he thinks this is what hell looks like. It's pretty clear that he doesn't think per se it is what it looks like, but it quite well could do. But he makes very clear his point in the beginning is not to say this is what hell looks like, but this is an indication for how we should live our life now. So having said that,
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, I was just going to say, feel free to jump in with any questions. Yeah.
Can you just operationally define the human condition? Like, what does that term mean for our purposes?
Meaning, you want me to define the human condition or define the term human condition?
The term.
Yeah, because one would take a lot longer. Obviously, the term would take a lot longer. The human condition generally is just terrible. So that's straightforward. I'm kidding. I hope that will become clear through our class. Let's put it that way. If by the end of today, you don't feel like there's been a settled idea and it's just a term that's flying around, I want to make it more clear, but it'll take unpacking. And obviously that means different things for different people. For our purposes, we're going to focus on Aristotle today. In his view of the human condition is going to be somewhat unintuitive and hopefully clear by the end of today. And if not, I'll make sure there are a few minutes before the end so people can ask questions.
But even like what are we describing? Maybe that's exactly what you just said, that we're going to describe what we're just going to describe. But like what even, like the human, we're going to talk about Aristotle's view of the human condition. So Aristotle's view of what? Like what aspect of humanity?
So I guess if it's helpful, I'll give you a preliminary rough outline of what that term indicates. It is not biological. If someone were to start talking about ventricles and hemispheres and veins and arteries, that is not a definition of the human condition. That is a description of the human body. The human condition is how we understand human life. And if that doesn't help, which I imagine it might not, it's precisely, but it's so hard to define. No one says, what is the lion's condition, right? The condition of the lion is it breathes, it eats, it moves. That's the end of it. The very idea, the very term human condition makes an argument just in its own existence that human beings are not mere animals. We're not meant to just eat and breathe. There's something that we are meant to be doing. And that instinct that as human beings, we have a purpose is essentially the question which the definition of human condition tries to answer. What is our purpose? That's essentially what the human condition means. Much later in history, the existentialist movement, Jean-Paul Sartre and others, led to a point where they said defining human purpose is itself impossible. There is no human purpose that is clear, which is why the existentialists so overwhelmingly pessimistic. But we're nowhere near the modern age in our description. We're going to be in the medieval period with Dante feeding off Aristotle, and Aristotle is incredibly clear in a way that will feel a little foreign, I imagine, to many of us, as we'll make clear as we go through. So, any more questions, thoughts? Great. Let's dive in. I'm going to share my screen with you as we begin to outline the shape of hell. So this is our introductory screen. Our purpose today, Hell's Moral Landscape, part 1. Stay tuned for part 2. This figure over here, by the way, is a famous painting of the school in Athens. This is Aristotle pointing down. This is Plato, whose hand you can't see, pointing up. Aristotle was seen as a turn away from his mentor Plato and far more concrete, talking about earthly matters, and Plato is a bit more abstract, talking about form and other things up in kind of abstract hypothetics. So that's the reason for that picture. Either way, this is an image for the Inferno. This is a city. At the beginning, Dante gets lost in the forest here. He makes his way in. He gets on the boat where Charon takes him across the river. He goes into the first circle of hell to Limbo. Here he meets Francesca and Paolo, and he gets judged by Minos, and there he sees Cerberus, a three-headed dog, and he makes it to the next circle. The next circle, here are the walls to the city of Dis, which he gets in, where he sees people being tormented by devils. He gets down here where he sees other mythic creatures, a circle of fire. So there are a lot of words, and this is just a pictorial representation, but there have been literally tens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of versions to how to depict this. Another example on your screen now, this is Satan in the middle, and this is a little more helpful in the sense that this is literally meant to be the globe. The way that Dante envisions in his narrative hell, this is Jerusalem on top up here, as you can tell from the various little domes. This is the dark wood where he gets lost as he veers in life off the straight path. And this is the gate where he gets into the gate of hell, and he makes into the first circle, second circle. And as you can see here, different numbered circles. This is circle 7. 8 is a number of miniature called bolge, or little bulges, where people get punished in 10 different ways for 10 different kinds of fraud. And then you got the 9th circle, the center of hell. Again, a lot of words, but we could do with more description. Just another 2 examples. Here on the right is a diagram that somebody tried to use to structure hell, where you can see, again, it gets narrower and narrower and narrower until you get to the final circle at the center of the earth. This is a helpful modern incarnation. You can see a helicopter there and some Hollywood signs. This is from, I think, a 2014 comic, I'm not looking for the word comic, but television version, animated version of the Inferno was made. And there were some pictures done where, again, you can see the different circles. And this is literally Dante's journey, where he has to step down to the different levels of hell. He makes it through a city called the city of Dis, which we said is in many ways models on the city of Thebes from the Roman poetry. He makes it through to the circle of violence over another river. Here's the sins of fraud, with lots of different sins, people getting burned and scarred and poked in all sorts of different ways in the different pockets. And then into the center where there is fraud, traitors being punished. Who's this? Anybody know?
Judas?
Yeah, Judas is one of the 3 supreme traitors in Dante's world, who is punished by being chewed on by Satan in the center of hell, literally gnawed on, eaten for eternity, which sounds incredibly uncomfortable. Now, this is just to make it a little more clear, and this may feel a little repetitive, but I'm hoping it will be clear. And I want, as we go through, to pay some attention. You don't have to commit this all to memory, of course, but just get a couple of senses. This is split into 2 pieces. So this is the first part of hell. And I'll note now, there is what's called upper hell and lower hell. Anyone who lives in Manhattan, there's upper Manhattan and lower Manhattan. No association or parallel being made, but there's upper hell and lower hell. And in my head, you would think, oh, upper is like higher up, so that would be worse. But of course, if you imagine hell is a descent, lower hell is the more extreme, the more severe, the more harsh punishment, and upper is a little easier. So in upper hell, which is from circles 1 to 6. So if I were to ask you, for example, how many circles is hell divided into and which ones are in upper and lower hell. I'm not saying that's a question I'll ask you, but this is a potential question. There are 9 circles to hell. Upper hell is 1 through 6, and then 7 through 9, we'll get to 8 and 9 in a minute, are lower hell. And they are divided here by the Phlegethon river. This is the river Styx. This is the river Acheron. That's the gate to hell that Dante comes into. He then crosses the river and he makes his way through limbo. The first circle, we got the second circle, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and what's after 6? Yep, you got it, 7. And these are punished. The first circle we'll get to as we go through the Inferno. Limbo is not a punishment. Limbo is a state where people, mainly pagans, who were born and died before the birth of Christianity, so could not be baptized, are stuck in this space in limbo. They can eternity. They are stuck here. They can never be redeemed. They can never get to heaven. They can't make their way through purgatory because they've not been baptized. That seems to be the premise. We'll make that more complicated as we go on, but that seems to be the premise. And they're stuck here in limbo. The second circle is where sins of lust are punished. Lust being people falling desperately in love, committing adultery, infidelity, generally to do with sexualized sins. That's going to be lust. Gluttony is usually to do with food in the context of greed, overstuffing oneself, taking more. I'm sure we've all had different times in our life where we've had parents or grandparents have different phrases. You know, your eyes are bigger than your stomach. Was anyone ever told that as a kid? I was told that all the time. Your eyes are bigger than your stomach. You're taking so much on your plate because it looks like you can eat it, but you obviously can't fit it in. That is a sin that I'm still guilty of now. When I go to a Golan and I order a lafa, every time I can't finish it. Every single time I can finish it, but when I finish it, I feel sick. And I should know that I don't want it. But when I go in, my eyes say, you can handle it. Either way. So maybe I'm a glutton. Yes, Bensi.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I feel like it's interesting that gluttony is like a bad thing in his perspective, like for a non-Jew. Like, wouldn't you think that's just like a Jewish kind of thing, like Kedoshim too? We don't want to like overeat, but for them, like, why do they view that as a bad thing to eat a lot?
So I think this is a very helpful comment. As we go along, I want us to be considering what does Jewish tradition have to say? Is lust a problem in Jewish tradition? So yeah, lust is a problem, right? Let me ask you a question. It should already stand out to us. If you were to try to hierarchize Jewish punishment, Jewish sin, and say, what is the most problematic, the most heinous Jewish averas? What might you list? Or where would you look to make a hierarchy? Benzi, Akiva, where would you start and say, I'm trying to figure out a framework to determine which averas are the worst? Where would you look? Where would you start?
Well, I'd start with the first 3 being as the worst, you know, the 3 that you have to die for.
Okay, so that's one framework to say, what are the technicalities of how I'm meant to react to them? Being, there are certain, almost everything I know I should live and commit. But there are 3 that I know I have to die rather than do. So presumably, those are the worst 3 metaphysically, mystically as well. And when I get to Shamayim, those are going to be the ones that stand out, presumably. It's not clear in halachic terms that that is the case. We know that on earth, the way we live, those 3 cannot be done. We have to die. It could be that that's for societal reasons, right? It could be HaKadosh Baruch Hu says those 3 cannot be done under any circumstances because it will corrupt the population. So it can't happen. But really, there are far worse things in terms of when you get to the next world. It could be, but that's one framework. Bensi, what you're going to say?
I was gonna say that.
Oh, you're going to say that. What's another framework if you were trying to think about last Shabbos? Say again?
Things in the Psukim, in the Bible.
Okay, so one way is to divide midoraisa from midrabanan. I think that's reasonable. And I mean, that, let's say, is eminently reasonable, right? So let's say within Min HaTorah, how do you divide what, if you were to design an inferno, which sins would you have in the center? So if you had the big 3 at the center, that would be one way to go. Another way to think about structuring which ones are worse of the 6, 1, 3 might be to...
Like this worldly punishment?
By punishment.
Say again?
By punishment, which one has the most severe punishment?
Okay, interesting. Which one do you have Chayiv Malchus? Which one's a Chayiv Misa? Which one are are really an assay that
Right.
is not punishable here, which are the lavshe in bo maisa. You could sit down and say, let's put out on a chart how you get punished for different averas and then chart it out that way. And the truth is, it could be that someone will come along and say, no, again, those are social punitive measures to enforce deterrence on earth. But there are some assays that if you are mavatal it, there's no punishment. But in Shamayim, you don't wear tefillin ever in your life. There's no punishment for that. You don't wear tefillin. But you get up to Shamayim, Hashem says, no, that you're being punished in the center. It could be, right? So what I'm trying to stress, and I'll come to you, Ruben, in 1 second, what I'm trying to stress here is that it's not clear in Jewish life that we would have such a hierarchy like this. Yes, Ruben.
I think there can be an argument being made versus intent. Like, if you did something, with malintent for like rebellion towards God versus, if you slipped up, I think that's for sure part of it.
Yeah, so this becomes, again, more complicated. What happens if I murder somebody by mistake? What happens if I, I guess this is going to sound odd. What happens if I commit adultery by mistake? Is that possible? It's discussed in here.
I think there's a question of just meaning I'm going to go eat pig right now because I'm mad at God. I'm going to rebel against God versus I'm going to eat pig right now because that Happy Meal really looks good.
Yeah. I think you're right. And one of the questions that we're going to have to weigh is, as Dante divides this, he's dividing circles by sin, it sounds like, right? Meaning lust, whether you did it intentionally or not, meaning whether this was rebellious against God or not, lust is over here. So we'll have to decide if that's the case or not as we go on. But Bensie's original question was, why is gluttony a problem for people who aren't Jewish? I guess the fundamental assumption we have to make is Christianity is essentially a child of Judaism. There are all sorts of principles about Jewish life that they reject, but what they might call the spirit of the Judeo-ethic, they embrace. And it is going to be so hard. And that's why your question is so important, because along the way, we have to make fine distinctions about what is Jewish, what is common to both traditions, what is uniquely Christian. Now, gluttony is a high, I'm in the impeachment mode. I was going to say a high crime and misdemeanor. So gluttony is one of the high crimes and misdemeanors of Christian history. If I were to say, what's the worst Jewish sin? And I asked 4,000 Jews, I imagine gluttony wouldn't come up among the top 10 problems. You eat too much. We all eat too much, right? So it's a problem. We've got to work on it. I was actually in the elevator once in, what's the new base medrash building? Gluck. I was once in Gluck in the elevator, and there's only like one, or there's two elevators, something, and like 30 of us needed to get in. So we all piled in. And one of the Rosh Yeshiva was in the elevator, and it started beeping saying, overweight, overweight. And he said, guilty, guilty, guilty. So we're all guilty of eating too much. But he is like, you're in circle number 3 already of hell if you eat too much. And we're all thinking, okay, so I eat too much, but I'm going to get to Shamayim. And he's like, no, eternity. You have no redemption if you're gluttonous and unrepentant. And the truth is, most of us are probably unrepentant. I mean, yeah, I'd love not to, but I'm not doing al chaitz because I ate too much. But in the Christian tradition, it is a central. And again, these are not just bad character traits. These are sins for which you spend eternity suffering. That's the assumption of Dante. So that's a helpful clarification. You've got avarice, prodigality, which is to do with being what we would call cheap in terms of money, not charitable, anger, assidia, which we'll have to clarify as we go on. These are the gates of dis to get through. And this is, I should say, not related to when somebody like disses somebody else. Anyone know what that's short for when you diss somebody? What does that even mean?
Disrespect.
Oh, is that what it's short for, to disrespect?
Dishonor?
I've no idea, but those both sound like good candidates, right? So this is something different we'll come to as we go through the Inferno. We've got heretics appear here in circle number 6. So he, again, has got a very clear hierarchy of lust, gluttony. Eating too much is worse than committing adultery. That's what it sounds like, which is astonishing. In answer to my question before, committing adultery by mistake is possible. It's discussed in Yevamos. If somebody thinks the room's dark and they don't realize who they're in the same room with. So in terms of intention, we'll have to get to. But here, lust seems to be quite clear in terms of its intentionality, that this is a conscious act that is produced by an impulse. That's the assumption. Violence, this is where we have the transition to lower hell, where we've got the sins of violence, which has 3 subcircles: violence against others, against self, and against God. We then make our way to lower hell. As you can see, it suddenly gets quite steep, with the 8th circle having these different layers where you've got, and then the 9th circle with the treacherous fraud in the middle. Now, the 8th circle, you get different kinds of frauds: pimps and seducers, flatterers, simonists. Anyone know what simony is? Moshe?
Like a plagiar?
Say again?
No relation.
Say again?
It's like a plagiarizer.
Interesting. Simony we'll have to get into more depth as we get into the 8th circle, but largely speaking, the Christian context, it's essentially taking money as a priest, essentially bribery. It's essentially religious bribery. Moshe, there is no association being made here. And the truth is, right now, I have no idea why it's called simony. It's got nothing to do with the root of Shimon. I can't remember what the root is. We'll get there. But it's a particular kind of fraud where religious figures take money on false premises. Soothsayers, people that walk around predicting the future, knowing that it's just trash they're making up. In fact, we'll get there. The punishment of soothsayers is for eternity to walk around with their heads fixed on backwards, so they can only see behind them. So we'll have to get through what the means of justice and punishments are. We've got berators, hypocrites, thieves, counselors of fraud and war, violence, counterfeiters, and then we've got a series of giants in between 8 and 9. We've got 9th, different treacheries, traitorship, fraud against relatives, city, guests, and lords. Being a traitor to your guest is one of the most horrific acts one can do in Dante's structure. Hachnasat Orchim is an important mitzvah, but you wouldn't think like being mean to your guest is any worse than being mean to somebody on the street in Jewish thought. There is no extra responsibility for the fact that they're in my house. But in Christian Western tradition, that is a huge trope. In fact, one of Shakespeare's major plays has the premise where the central villain is guilty of this horrific treatment. Anyone know who I'm referring to?
Beth.
I was going to say, if you say the play, you have to do a little jig because it's an unlucky name. Yes, Macbeth, where the king, Macbeth, kills the previous king, Duncan, as he's hosting him in his home, which kind of marks him in Shakespearean tradition, Christian tradition, as the worst sort of traitor. Not just that he kills his king, but he kills him as a guest. And what you see here is actually a building sense of how horrific, because that was treachery against his lord and benefactor. It was treachery against a guest and against his city. So he is one of the worst figures. And then in the center, you've got Lucifer. So we've now divided up hell. This is on your screen right now, what we would call Dante's cosmology. This is the entirety of his vision, where you've got Jerusalem here. This is the globe of earth. We've got Jerusalem, which is earthly life, the dark wood. This is hell, where you work your way into hell. Then you have purgatory on the other side, which has different levels divided into 7 different spheres connected to the 7 deadly sins in Christian tradition. And then you have the way up to heaven, or what's called the Empyrean, through the different planets. This is hell, where again, you've got the vestibule, which we'll come to before we get into hell. Then we've got the first circle, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth circle, then the 7th, 8th, and 9th. Here you've got purgatory, building your way up through the different levels of 7 mainly sins, 1 here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then we have in the middle, I've got here for you the journey up to heaven and paradise. For our purposes, we're not going to do purgatory or paradise. We're just doing the inferno. But again, this division is central. The division here between lower hell and upper hell. And it's going to be essential for us. I see time is marching on. I hope all right. I'll just keep talking instead of talking about what I'm worried about. is that this is the juncture at which Dante turns to his guide and says to Virgil, I don't get what's going on here. I don't understand. Isn't God's wrath binary? Either he likes you or he doesn't like you. Either he's angry with you or he's not. Either you're good or you're bad. And if you are sinful, you should be punished. And there should be one sort of punishment that everybody gets until they're done with punishment. Why are there people here who are being punished in marshes? Why are there people whose heads are inverted? Why are there people being bitten by snakes for eternity? And other people who are forced to sit underground, and other people who are burned in? Just explain to me, why are some people tormented in a city and some people sitting in the countryside? Just explain it to me. This is the moment between 6 and 7, between lower and upper hell. And this is when Virgil turns around and says, oh, let me explain to you how hell is structured. And now you can see why it's important for us to do this now, because we don't want to be like Dante, where it takes us until circle number 7 to get a sense of why things are divided up this way. And it's important for us to know that Dante is not the perfect figure. He is learning as he goes along, and he's going to experience confusion, but we don't want to experience that confusion. We want to see him as confused so we understand what he's learning. So that is the juncture, and I'll have a little GPS signal for you just for the sake of it. This is where Dante is, where he has that reflection, and he says to Virgil, what's the blueprint here? And this is from Canto number 11. I've not got the Italian for you, but I will read for you Dante's words, and then I'll give you Virgil's response. Now, but tell me, Dante says, those of greasy swamp, those driven by wind and beaten by rain, and those who collide with such harsh words, why are they not punished inside the ruddy city if they are under God's wrath? And if not, meaning if they're not under God's wrath, why are they treated so? This is essentially Dante turning to his Roman poetic guide saying, what's happening? Why are people being punished in different ways? It doesn't make any sense to me. To which Virgil responds, do you not remember the words with which your ethics treats so fully 3 dispositions that heaven refuses? Don't you remember? In Aristotle's Ethics, he describes 3 personalities, 3 dispositions that God rejects. Now, before we get any further, does Aristotle talk about God?
No,
Yeah,
definitely
correct.
Not. Definitely not the Christian God.
Correct, right. Meaning not particularly. He's speaking about ethics, about the way people live. He does refer to the soul, which was an ancient assumption that there is a unseen force that generates us, that when we die disappears, and when we're alive is here. There is some sort of force inside us, which is called, what for better or worse, called the soul through all these texts. But he doesn't quite talk about heaven or hell. He's just talking about earth and how to live. So you already see that there is a adaptation of Aristotle by talking about what heaven refuses. But he says there are 3 kind of figures that are described by Aristotle as being problematic, which are incontinence, malice, and mad bestiality. Now, what is incontinence? Anybody know? So I'll give you a clue. It is not the colloquial sense that we use today. Incontinence used today, I hope nobody has any relatives and any kind of friends to which they are familiar with this term, but I'm sure many of us do. It is when you lose physical control over your bowels and other parts of the human body. That's called incontinence, the inability to exert control. That's literally what incontinence means, lack of control. And this is not talking about somebody who doesn't have physical control over their body in terms of digestion and bowel movement. That is not what this is about, but it is about lack of control over impulse and instinct. So we're going to come to that very shortly. But there are essentially 3 characters. This is for your reference at the beginning of book 7 of Nicomachean Ethics, where Dante says there are the incontinent. He doesn't use the word malice. He says vice, the vicious, and the brutish or mad bestiality. For our purposes, we can ignore mad bestiality because it's essentially an impossible condition where a human being has devolved essentially into pure vice, where they are guilty of every wrong, of every sin, are defined by as essentially a brute, essentially forfeited their humanity. And the opposite of bestiality for Aristotle is essentially superhuman virtue, which is essentially godly. So those conditions we can forget about. But the central two are incontinence and malice, or what Aristotle refers to as incontinence and vice. Those are the two central divisions of what God does not want. And what Virgil goes on to explain is that, and this is important, upper hell is populated by the incontinent, and lower hell is populated by the vicious, those who commit vice. So his central distinction is between incontinence on the one hand and vice on the other, where vice is worse than incontinence. Incontinence, you're in upper hell; vice, you're in lower hell. And as per our diagram here, everything above this point is incontinence, limbo, lust, gluttony, avarice, prodigality, anger, heresy. All that is seen as incontinence. Everything beneath from 7, violence and fraud. Essentially, those are the two main categories which we'll spend more time on next time. But violence and fraud centrally are vice. That's the distinction, and you are more guilty as a human being if you are vicious than just incontinent. That seems to be the division made by Aristotle. Now, Mark.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Why is heresy considered incontinence?
Absolute great question. And we'll have to come to that when we get to the 6th circle. So stay tuned. Don't do anything heretical until then. Okay? That's we'll get there. Good question. So Mark Cogan in the Design in the Wax takes Virgil to task by taking him up on his description. He says to Dante, "You're confused. Well, don't you remember Aristotle's Ethics?" At which Dante turns around and says, "Oh, give me a break. I was exhausted in college. I didn't pay attention to any of my classes. I didn't do any of the readings. So tell me, Virgil." And at that point, Virgil tells him the difference between incontinence and vice. Now, what Cogan does is he says, we need to do a couple of things here. We need to go back and look at Aristotle and see his distinction between incontinence and vice. And then we need to see if that matches up with Dante. And here's the clue. It doesn't. It does not match. What Aristotle has to say about vice and incontinence does not map onto Dante's description of the Inferno, which I was hoping will become clear by the end of today. We have 19 minutes. I'm going to have to rush through some of this material. We may have some left next time, in which case I'll abridge what we were going to do next time. But that's what Cogan wants us to do. He wants us to take him to task by going back to the ethics and take it apart. Now, what you'll see on your screen now, for those of you who've taken a course with me before, which is not a large proportion, but I apologize if you have, these 4 letters on your screen are tools that I found in my life incredibly helpful when analyzing an essay, a piece of text, even a poem. PTAI, which stands for problem, thesis, argument, implications. And it seems intuitive and straightforward, but it is incredibly helpful when reading a text when you're taking notes on a piece of paper, on a pad of paper, put those 4 letters at the top and then put a line across the page, PTAI, and then take your notes underneath. And as you go through the text, try to decipher P. What is the central problem? What is the question that this essay is trying to address? Sometimes it's clear and it's right up front, right at the top. This is the question I want to address. And sometimes people write either in a clumsy way or in an attempt to be persuasive in a little bit obscure terms. And you have to kind of dig it out. What is the central problem that they are trying to address? Number 1, that's P. T, it's the thesis. What is essentially their answer? If I can isolate one sentence or I can paraphrase one portion of the essay that is an answer to the question, I will have a much clearer sense of what I'm gaining from this essay. And then A, the argument, which is what are the stages in the essay that justify the thesis, the claims being made to defend the thesis. And I, implications are, okay, beyond the scope of the argument, where does this lead in other spheres? What are the moral implications, social, political, ethical, religious? What are all the implications of this argument and this thesis? So those are broad terms. I know I did assign the reading. I'm going to be, apologies for my presumption. I'll try to do this as if nobody had read it, because I don't want to condescend anybody. But this is the central problem that Kogan wants to address in the parts that I assigned, meaning in the opening of the first chapter, the first 11 pages, and really the first 70 pages. But we're going to focus on the first 11 and then maybe the next 20. So the problem is, what is the significance of the shape of hell? From the images that we've just seen on our screens, from the attention that Virgil gives to the divine, that Dante clearly puts into this design, that Dante has an architecture in mind. There's something very specific about the structure and the shape of this realm. So what is the significance? Why has Dante done this? Is his problem, and his thesis is, in terms of the Inferno, we're not talking about paradise or purgatory, which will have a different answer. But here, and this is a specific term, this thesis has been specifically constructed by yours truly. He doesn't put it in these words, but this is me trying to extract from his essay, what is the significance? It is a dual significance. It captures a religious and a rational sense of justice. That is the point of hell, to capture justice in both a religious and a rational way, so that we can understand how to live our lives on earth in a religious and rational way. That is the point of significance of the shape of hell. Now, his argument is, firstly, we go through Aristotle's theory. What is incontinence? What is vice? Then we go through Dante's rereading and say, okay, Dante obviously doesn't buy Aristotle's theory because it doesn't work with the Inferno. So how does he understand Aristotle? And then we map it onto the Inferno. Those are the three stages of his argument, and the implications are beyond our scope, but worth discussion. Now, we're going to pay attention in the next hour, but really 15 minutes, to Aristotle's theory. What is Aristotle's theory, as Zach asked, of the human condition? Now, to get to his theory of the human condition, I want to ask a straightforward question, which does presume in no way that you have read Aristotle. I'm just asking you for your gut reaction. What is the definition of the word virtue? You can paraphrase it. You can give me a single term. You can give me a general description. What does the word virtue mean? V-I-R-T-U-E. Yes, Jakob.
Is it like teaching through example?
Teaching through example. Interesting. You heard it.
An above average positive trait.
A positive trait. Excellent. Ruben.
Acting beyond nature.
Acting beyond nature. Interesting. That would be a virtue, or that meaning could someone...
I guess in a positive manner, meaning based on
Okay.
human expectation.
Okay, meaning going beyond the letter of the Lord. Lifnim Mashur Hadin, you'd say is virtue. Okay, interesting. Any other alternatives, thoughts?
I have a suggestion also.
Yeah,
Oh.
go on.
I guess I won't read off Google, but something like other people will give reverence or sort of covered for the action.
Okay, interesting. Something that has public esteem. Interesting. So here are some, you could just Google this. This is the definition of virtue on Google, which is behavior showing high moral standards, a quality considered morally good or desirable in a person, good or useful quality of a thing. You could, for example, extol the virtues of a car. The car, you wouldn't say is working beyond nature, but you say, oh, this car has certain virtues, meaning that are good about it. It's basically positive. In archaic terms, virtue was saying, you would say, is she a woman of virtue? And it had particular connotations, which mean, is she chaste? The second meaning is not that important for us, but in Christian angelology, anyone familiar with angelology? Well, that's a study of, one guess?
Angels.
Yep, not angels, angels, the study of angels. The seventh highest order of the ninefold celestial hierarchy is virtue. Now, that sounds incredibly specific and strange, but that is a good pivot or segue for us, because virtue sometimes has a very, very technical meaning. And while we use the word virtue all the time as essentially good midos of virtues, meaning, oh, you did something good. That's a great virtue. Being friendly is a virtue. Those are good things. We kind of use that broadly. When Aristotle used the term, he is very specific, and he says virtue equals the following: a dispossession that perfects the operation of the soul. So this is, in one sentence, You don't have to read the Nicomachean Ethics now. I've solved it for you. A disposition that perfects the operation of the soul. That's what a virtue is. It sounds very technical, and this could lead to a number of questions, meaning, what do you mean the operation of the soul? How does the soul operate? Is there a mechanics to the soul? To which the answer Aristotle would have is, yes, there is a mechanics. I will tell you the different parts of the soul, the mechanics of the soul, how it works. And in the same way that when you buy a new computer or you buy a new car or you have a new piece of technology, there is a user's manual to tell you, how do you get the most out of this? How is this meant to work? Aristotle's ethics is essentially a user manual for the human soul, saying you have been bequeathed with a soul, whether it's from God or fate or nature, whatever you want to call it. We all have souls, Aristotle claims, and it is designed to work in a certain way. We can corrupt it, which is not for him a religiously valent term that means that you've stained it somehow, but meaning you're not using it properly. If you take a hairdryer and you try to use it to fry an egg, it might work on some level. That's not how it's meant to be used. If you want to fry an egg, use a frying. There are good ways to do things. And the soul is meant to work in certain ways and accomplish certain things and certain behaviors, certain traits. What he calls virtues are the ways that a disposition that perfect the operation of the soul. That's his definition. And the way that we can see this from a loose quote of his is that happiness comes from the perfect practice of virtue. And this is his claim. And again, that's why the word happiness is so important. It is not about entertainment or, smiling or laughing. Happiness meaning a sense of human equanimity, that I feel that I'm doing the right thing, that I have a sense of calm and purpose. That sense comes from the perfect practice of virtue. Living a virtuous life, before we look at Aristotle, just colloquially, living a virtuous life gives you what? You would say a place in Shamayim. I don't know. God wants you to do that. Aristotle's version is the practice of virtue has nothing to do with the next world. The practice of virtue makes you happy. And again, that doesn't mean you're going to wake up grinning all the time. It means that it makes you have an inner sense of equanimity. I'm functioning right. In the same way that if we have a physical ailment, we don't feel good until we've taken medicine, or you'll have a physio come to do exercises with you to make sure your muscles are working well. For Aristotle, virtues are the exercises of the soul that make your mind sit at ease, that give you happiness. And the way that this is achieved for Aristotle is through attaining habits. And you get habits through practice. The more you practice certain habits, the more you give charity, the more often, for our purposes, we'll say the more often that you pray, the more often that you are patient, the more often that you do certain things, you acquire habits. And the more you habitualize virtue, the happier you become. That's essentially his argument. And it is, as we've said, a user manual. That is the Nicomachean Ethics. It sounds like it's a complicated branch of philosophy. It is in many ways a study for how to live life happy. That is the ethics. Now, having said that, what are the mechanics of the soul? And I'm conscious of the fact we have 8 minutes to do the mechanics of the soul, so we'll do it relatively briefly. Aristotle argues, and this is not all necessary for Dante, but it is building blocks to get to a point where we'll see a major conflict or divergence between Aristotle and Dante, which will in itself lead to a very important question and point for our purposes. So we're going to do this step by step. The first thing we're doing, so you know what, I don't want to rush too quick, so I don't want to make this feel like a tidal wave. So let's take a step back for a moment. This is what we're going to do. 3 steps. Number 1, Virgil claims hell is modeled on Aristotle, right? So step 2 is let's look at Aristotle. That is not going to match with Dante. So we now have a problem. Why is Virgil being disingenuous? What's happening? Number 3, we can see how Dante is rereading Aristotle. So Virgil is not being disingenuous. He is being honest when he says Aristotle is the designer, the architect of hell, but it's being read differently. And then we map that on to the Inferno. Within those three stages that Virgil says it's Aristotle, it doesn't look like Aristotle. Dante is rereading Aristotle. There are a couple of questions that will emerge that we'll have to address. For example, if Dante has to reread Aristotle to make it work, what's the easiest thing to do? If Aristotle doesn't quite work with your system and you have to kind of force him in to make it work, what would the easiest thing to be for Virgil to turn around and say?
Maybe not base it on Aristotle.
Yeah, just drop the guy, right? Be done with him. If you have to kind of twist him into a pretzel to make him work, don't do it. So there is a compelling reason, it seems, that Dante insists that Aristotle is the architect. It's not happenstance. It's not serendipity. It's not convenience. Oh, look, my theory happens to fit with Aristotle. I'll use him. He twists Aristotle to make it work. So there's a fundamental need he feels to use Aristotle as his architect. So we're going to have to ask, why? Why does he insist on Aristotle being his architect? And that will be part of the reason of why we need to do this, to see how he differs from Aristotle, to get a sense for how he changes him, and then defend why he feels that he needs him. And if he does need him, why does he change him? Change hell to make it fit with Aristotle. So there are conflicting tensions here, where there are essentially two motives we're going to unfold. The first motive is, I need Aristotle to be my architect. The second motive is, I can't use Aristotle in his original. I need to make changes. So we have to address, why do you feel like you need this guy, number one, and why do you feel like you need to make changes? So those two questions, the answers to those two questions are going to be quite pertinent for how Dante wants us to live our life. And we could address also from a Jewish angle, which side of the equation, the pre-Dante Aristotle or the adapted version, are more in line with Jewish thought. So we'll have to, and again, every time we raise these issues, in theory, if they pique your interest, it is a potential avenue for you to pursue if you want to do a final paper on this. And again, we can talk about the details of a final paper another time, length, reference, whatever you want. Again, not designed to be a burden, but to make this a meaningful, productive experience for you. But if you've got an interest of, Aristotelian overlap with Jewish medieval thought, this is an avenue to pursue, and this is a productive discussion. Now, we have 4 minutes left to do Aristotle's version of the soul. So we're not going to do that in 4 minutes. So what I'll do is I'll finish this slide, and then we'll continue next time. Now, for Aristotle, there are 3 parts of the soul. There is, and some of this may be familiar to you from medieval Jewish thought, and you'll see this in a number of the Mefarshim from the medieval period, that the soul is made up of 3 different parts. You've got the nutritive, the sensitive, and the rational. We share the nutritive in common with plants, in the same way that plants photosynthesize and do active transport and have certain chemical reactions as a living thing. We have nutritive parts. We have chemical reactions, certain digestive juices go. There are certain synapses that fire. Different things happen to us chemically. That's a nutritive part. That is a non-rational part of the soul. Do we exert any control over that? Do I have any rational control over my digestion? No. So in that context, there are no virtues. So if we split down the soul into its mechanics, there are no virtues, meaning there are no exercises for that part of the soul that I can use to perfect its function, because I've got no control over that. I have no control whatsoever over the chemistry. If you want to be a good driver, and I try to give you the user manual to drive well, none of it involves knowledge of the chemical breakdown of fuel. That is beyond your control when you're driving. The way you digest, not in your control. Sensitive issues, things that we share with animals, that is appetite, sensation, movement, me moving my arm. Do I have rational control over my sensitive function? The answer to that is partially, right? Do I have any control over my breathing? Yeah, I can hold my breath, I can speed it up, I'm conscious of it, but it's also just a human appetite to breathe. It's kind of built in. There are other appetites. Hunger. Do I have any control over my hunger? To some degree, I'm naturally hungry, but I can suppress my hunger. I can satisfy my hunger. I can oversatisfy. So that's why it's partially rational. And there are moral virtues. That's what they're called. In the sensitive part of the soul, there are moral or ethical virtues, practices that if I do often enough, I'll develop habits that make my reason overwhelm my appetites and train them to be positive appetites, to only have hunger when I need to eat. To only have will when there is something good that I should be doing. Now, the rational part, which we do not share with any other creatures, other animals feel hunger and exhaustion in the same way that we do, but the rational part of the soul that is to do with cerebral abstraction, calculation, theoretical parts of human practice. We don't share that with animals. That's uniquely human. And there are intellectual virtues to perfect that part of the soul. Now, we've got 1 minute left, and we'll have, these are just a smattering of virtues. And what we'll get to next time is the import of this for our purposes. But I hope that serves an introduction that we can just overview very briefly next time. But I will finish with one thought on the basis of what we've done now. What does the perfect person look like for Aristotle? According to what we've just read about virtues being exercises to perfect the soul's functioning, if you were to give me one word for like the perfect person, and there may not be one right answer to this, what might you suggest?
Rational.
Say again, Josh?
The most rational person. Yes.
Most rational. Yeah. So if I were to give a label, which is not intuitive, but if I were to give a label, it would essentially be mechanical, robotic. There would be no resistance from the appetites. The perfect human being would function perfectly in the same way the perfect car that had been maintained the best would function perfectly. You should be making very little choices in life as the perfect soul. You just kind of do the virtuous thing all the time by nature because you've habitualized yourself. This is a massive dispute in Jewish philosophical terms about whether the perfect person is the person who makes decisions to do good all the time or the person who naturally does good all the time. And Aristotle takes a clear position on this argument where virtues are exercises to perfect us so that we don't have to make decisions essentially, and we do the right thing because we know it's the right thing all the time. It's 4:16. This will become important next time. But in the meantime, I want to wish you a productive continuation of the week. Thursday, please God, I'll be on campus, and we'll go from there. Good to see you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.